Welcome to the Global Prayer Network with Reverend Dr. Seth O'Lardy. We pray this teaching will impact your life and bring you closer in your walk with Jesus. Let's get ready to receive today's teaching from Reverend Dr. Seth O'Lardy.
I am so excited about our speaker today. I hope it doesn't come across in the wrong way, but I'm excited to be a Black person. I am glad to be a Black person. When you think about, the contribution that Black people have made to this universe, I'm not talking about just America, but to the universe as a whole. When Herod tried to kill Jesus, we preserved him. The need for science and engineering and mathematics and medicine, you name it. I'm just excited to be a Black person. But we have to learn, because God said, my people are destroyed for the lack of knowledge. And so education is going to be extremely important if we're going to make it. Today, we have a young man who I met when I returned to Winston-Salem. And as I moved around, I was told that I had to meet this young man. And I said to myself, why do I need to meet him? And then I heard more and more. The more I went around, I heard, you have to meet this young man. And sure enough, I called him and we scheduled a meeting. And when I saw him, you wouldn't be able to determine his height, but he is twice my size in height. Very tall young man, very tall young man. And he tells me he's one of the tallest in his family. And I was telling him that he must come from the Mali tribe in Africa. That's where most of the tall people are. But the point I want to make today, and that's the reason why we have him with us, he reminds me of so many people. W.E.B. Du Bois. He reminds me of Marcus Garvey. He reminds me of Booker T. Washington. He reminds me of Dr. King, who are not only learned people, but are people who are making a difference in society. And so we met. I was impressed with him. Then he invited me to a meeting. I went to the meeting, and again, I saw his passion for the business of education, and not just education, but how do we empower our people? Him and his group have come up with a plan. And according to the meeting I was there, they showed last year where at about the same time we're having a meeting sometime I think in November. So over 800 plus students had been suspended from classes. But because of the program that he put in place and was ratified by the school board, that whole thing was slashed in almost half. Now you don't have 800 young people out of school, but it was down to almost 300 or so. I'm saying these are the kinds of young people we need. He's a young man. He's a young man, but he's talented, he's gifted. He comes out of New York. He's a product of New York. And he was blessed to come through the Riverside Church there in New York. It's another big church. If you ever gone to New York before, under the tutelage of the Honorable James Forbes. I knew Dr. Forbes. Went to school in Chicago and is a candidate for his PhD. But he is a passionate practitioner of progress. That's a good way to put it. He's a passionate practitioner of progress in education, and he's going to be coming back to us again to talk about another aspect, which is very, very important. But today I'm so excited and delighted to please share with you His Excellency, the Reverend, soon to be Dr. Paul Robeson. We'll talk about the name Robeson another time. But that's the kind of individual we have who will be sharing with us today. I hope that you could call as many people, because someone texted me this morning, say our country is in trouble when you talk about dismantling education. So we're glad to have him. We're going to pray, and then we'll have some music. And then afterwards, the next voice we'll hear will be none other than a very, very wonderful young man that is a good friend that already has won my heart and my mind because of his passion. He's not just about being another wonderful minister, but he's a minister who's ministering and making a difference. Let us pray. God, we thank you for Reverend Dr. Paul Robeson Ford and for the passion you've placed in him, for the favor you have on his life. Lord, we just pray that you'll continue to use him. We ask now blessings for each and every person that you've allowed to join us now, who will join us and who will watch it by way of our YouTube channel. We just want to thank you for this moment. We ask that you'll bless us to realize the greatness that is in us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Larty, I'm so grateful for this opportunity. I definitely know who to go to if I ever need a glowing letter of recommendation, reference. Honored by your kind words, grace, in providing this opportunity. These are difficult days that we are facing right now, and so this conversation is so important. Bishop Larty did ask me to speak a bit on some of the discussion that's going on right now about the future of the Department of Education. So I will address that towards the end of this presentation. I'm going to screen share a few very simple slides. Not much for these sorts of presentations, but managed to put a few things together. My primary interest here is really in sharing some important content. When we are thinking about education that empowers a generation, particularly as we think about our Black and brown young men and women, we really have to be focused on educating to elevate. And that is the overall subject that I want to address today. And what are we talking about when we're talking about educating to elevate? We're talking about the importance of liberated learning spaces, liberated and liberating learning spaces. And the reason why we must create in situations where they do not exist and foster in situations where there are pieces but not the full manifestation of liberated learning spaces is because of the insight that Dr. Carter G. Woodson taught us so many years ago in his well-known book, The Miseducation of Negro. When you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, he will cut one for his special benefit. His education makes it necessary. And when we think about the very current live political context that we are living in right now, and what led us to this place as we sit here at the beginning of another Black History Month, the year of our Lord 2020, it is worthwhile to reconsider the context in which Dr. Carter G. Woodson was writing and speaking. And it was a context of segregation, of formal racial stratification. And so the image and the metaphor here of the proper place and the back door, and cutting the back door, was very real and resonated with those who were reading this literature in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, because that was the reality. And what Dr. Carter G. Woodson recognized is that the central piece at issue was not the physical back doors that Black people were being directed to walk through. It was not the physical back of the bus. It was not the physical balcony of the theater that they were being relegated to, but it was the chains on their minds, that made them willing and accustomed to and oriented and ready to accommodate conditions that created their own subjugation, marginalization, and disadvantaged status. That there was a level of complicity because there was not a consciousness to refuse and resist. And so liberated learning spaces are about ensuring that the disconnect that we are dealing with now, where we are at least a generation or two from the days of Black consciousness, from the days of greater solidarity in the Black community, from the days when Black people understood, just as a general rule, that what should distinguish us should be the contributions we were making to our uplift. The days of race men and race women, as we used to refer to them. We have to renew that, especially for such a time as this, because the further away our younger generations get from that history and from that generation, from that context of consciousness thought, the more we are at risk of the chains on the minds being the ones that actually are the central cause for our downfall, because of the ways in which those chains will make us complicit with and even seeking out the very things that will keep us underfoot and oppressed. And so this is why we must create liberated learning spaces. What are liberated learning spaces? Liberated learning spaces are platforms that foster engagement, critical thinking, that raise consciousness, that build character, and that prepare people to pursue purpose. I see my dear colleague and sister and friend, Dr. Nash, on the call today, and she and I talk often with other folks that we are working with about the fundamental reality that the root of the racialized achievement gap that we continue to see in education across the board, the root of the disruptive behavior that is so often the center of conversation because of salacious videos that go viral, because of the persistent numbers, some of which Bishop Larchie alluded to earlier, that show racially disproportionate exclusionary discipline rates, and the live reality of the persistent school-to-prison pipeline. The root of all of this is that students are disengaged in the classroom. They are disengaged from the standard curriculum. They are disengaged from what is being taught up front, so to speak. They are disengaged from the educational activities that are going on. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, and we'll speak a bit more about that on some of the slides that are about to come. But that engagement piece is so critical. Liberated learning spaces are spaces that are intentionally designed to engage our young people, and then also to teach them to think critically, to think for themselves. Nothing is more precious to human beings and to us as a collective of humanity than the right to self-determination. But in order to be able to exercise the right of self-determination in a way that is responsible and in a way that leads to uplift and prosperity and the assertion of dignity, you have to be able to think critically, especially in this day when social media has become a platform for so much misinformation, conspiracy theories that are rooted in racist and misogynist lies, ways of thought, and people are being fed a line of information that is designed to radicalize them in ways that alienate them from what is actually in their own best interests. We have to raise consciousness. Dr. Gregory Carr, well-known professor at Howard University, made the point on the radio the other day: consciousness comes before unity. Consciousness comes before unity. As we lament unity that has been lost over the years, particularly in the transition from segregation into integration, and lament the results of the November 5th election and some of the various ways that that broke down, we have to understand that there is a lack of consciousness in our communities, and it's because there's a lack of consciousness that is being taught and raised among our children. This is especially key for Black and brown boys and girls in this country. We have to build character, and we have to prepare people to pursue their purpose. Part of why children are increasingly disengaged the older they get is because they have an emerging sense of what they're actually interested in, what brings them a sense of joy and piques their interest. And that, of course, is something that will eventually point them towards their purpose. And we have to be intentional about acknowledging that and wrapping around that, and nurturing and fostering that, because you will only be satisfied with the balance of your life if you are pursuing and seeing some fulfillment of your purpose. We know that as adults who have engaged in a level of self-reflection, we have to give that gift of sharing that knowledge with our young people so that they do not waste time chasing after things that don't mean anything to you. When we talk about engagement, I mentioned earlier, capturing the interests of our young people and resonating with disparate learning styles. We do not all learn the same. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, white man, who pointed out to me who's dyslexic and really has a passion around challenges, opportunities for dyslexic children and adults, and pointed out to me that over 50% of those incarcerated are dyslexic, right? And it's another spin, another permutation of the reality that we know that the disengagement that is the center of so many other negative outcomes that happen is really expressed through so many different lenses of the things that we classify as different learning styles or disabilities or different abilities, all of this sort of thing. Many of our young people are bodily and kinesthetic learners. They learn by tactile engagement and activities. They learn by doing things. And so sitting in the traditional classroom that may be based on lectures or even small group conversations may or may not be what engages them. There is such an overlap in the data between not just Black and brown students, but students with disabilities being subject to disproportionate rates of exclusionary discipline, because students with disabilities, as they are broadly defined, simply have different ways of engaging the world that don't fit neatly into our traditional practices of education on a mass level. Liberated learning spaces in order to free everyone to fulfill the totality of their purpose have to resonate with these disparate learning styles instead of punishing them or sidelining them because of it. And of course, building personal relationships. And that's the broadest way to talk about something that many of you probably hear about a whole lot more these days, sometimes in a boogeyman way, because other folks who don't know anything about it want to portray it as such, which is SEL, social and emotional learning, trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive approaches to care and relationship. And now a new phrase that is being emphasized, healing-centered practices, because we know that young people coming from historically marginalized communities are also much more likely to show up with higher rates of ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences that are a function of growing up in poverty, sometimes a function of growing up without a two-parent home, growing up with a greater exposure to domestic violence, to violence in the community, to all of the sorts of traumas that come from housing insecurity and barriers to transportation that make barriers to accessing types of experiences, and even some of the basic things that you and I might take for granted if we're not living in similar circumstances. And so building relationships requires the trauma-informed, SEL-informed, healing-centered lens in order to meet young people where they are in a way that is culturally competent and affirming of individuals, and really communicate something very basic that we talk about in ministry circles all the time. People people don't care what you know unless they know that you care. And as a youth pastor put it many years ago, the rules without relationship breeds rebellion. You will be shocked and amazed to find that educators and instructors and teachers who focus as much on building relationships and rapport with their young people and getting to know them and having fun with them in ways that are appropriate to the teacher-student relationship, those sorts of things, have much less trouble with the sorts of behavioral issues that we so often hear about and see in these viral incidents, because all of that is a central part of engagement. I spoke about purpose and helping young people to identify their passions, but also their strengths and the things that bring them joy. Very few of us are strong at everything, but most of us are strong at a couple of things that if we lean into, we can really have success and, in the broadest scheme of things, experience a beautiful life. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose birth we just celebrated here in recent weeks, one of his lesser known writings, but very important ones that he actually penned for the school paper, so to speak, when he was at Morehouse College as a college student there. And he wrote an essay on the purpose of education. He said the function of education, therefore, is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. But education which stops with efficiency may prove the greatest menace to society. The most dangerous criminal may be the man gifted with reason, but with no morals. The naked truth, as Bishop Larty would put it, is that right now, we think about what is going on at the level of the federal government. We are being subject to a tyrannical regime that is led by people with no moral grounding when it comes to doing what is right, when it comes to privileging the interests of the poor and those who are most marginalized in our community, when it comes to addressing the needs for equity with those communities that have been historically disadvantaged because of racism, classism, white supremacy, and all of the other ones that we could name. There is a lack of a moral grounding that is guiding these individuals, and that results and is the root of so much of what we are seeing today. So Dr. King understood that the ability to think intensively and to think critically, that these were the goals of education, and they are central to what I'm talking about here in terms of a liberated learning space. And the central question that we have to be asking ourselves, understanding the history of how education has been used in this country, is what are we educating young people for? What is the purpose of education? So this is why I've emphasized building character, raising consciousness, and teaching people to think critically, and helping them to identify and see their strengths and their purpose in life. Because otherwise, what we are doing is we are simply preparing young people to fit into, neatly into, and to plug into a system that does not actually have their best interest, their prosperity, and flourishing at heart. If you study the history of education, you'll see that at certain points, the emphasis on what should be the focus of public education, all the way down to the way that classrooms were physically designed, desks were set up, and students were expected to sit and to engage and behave, was to prepare them for the latest shifts in what was happening in the mainstream economy and industry. And what I'm talking about in particular there was preparing people to work in warehouses, preparing people to be on the assembly line, which may fulfill some people's purpose, but isn't going to fulfill the purpose of a whole lot of people, and also prepares them to be subservient in a society where the few control the wealth, while the masses are seeking for the basics. And that is not the way things are supposed to be. Paulo Freire understood that education should instill an increased capacity for choice and the ability to participate in the historical process, going back to the example I gave about preparing students to just work on a factory line, to work in a warehouse as kind of a cog in the wheel. These are not situations that encourage people to be agents in the historical process, influencing the direction of the historical process, active in determining the way in which we do things and how we do things and how resources are distributed and what the ends of our work are. Education is and always will be a political act. And it is important to understand that those who speak in disparaging ways about the politicization of education are just upset because their political ideology is not being affirmed by those platforms of education. Education has always been a political act that is driven by a desire to prepare a certain type of person to carry on the legacy of what is important to us as we understand how to build and sustain societies that are marked and characterized by justice and equity, or its opposite. So education is and always will be a political act, and we just have to be intentional around what type of young person we are trying to foster and nurture and produce if we have any hope of building a more just and equitable society and actually reaching the fullest manifestation of our humanity in the generations to come. I want to encourage everyone here, if you're not familiar with it, look up online the Black Genius Framework and the Village of Wisdom, which is based out of Central North Carolina here, over Raleigh-Durham area. This is just an overview of some of the elements of the Black Genius Framework, which is one of the key tools I would suggest when we ask ourselves the question, well, how do we foster and build liberated learning spaces for such a time as this? These elements, interest awareness, selective trust, racial identity, and a can-do attitude, and concern and focus on social justice, navigating the multicultural space and realities of the different types of students who are entering our educational spaces. This is central. and it's based both on engagement with parents and students, and it is based on evidence that supports that when you implement Black Genius frameworks, Black students in particular do better. They perform better. The achievement gap closes. The disengagement from the classroom shifts in a positive direction. Exclusionary discipline begins to recede from its prominent place in so many of our conversations. But it takes resources, and it takes a reorientation that is anchored by a concern for liberated learning spaces. So that is the general presentation there. I do want to speak, per Bishop Lawton's request, to the situation right now that is swirling around the Department of Education and the concerns that there are as to what is going to happen. And just a brief overview, there's so much here, and this is part of the challenge, right? That there's kind of a blitzkrieg tactic that is being taken right now by the administration to deluge us and flood the zone with so much on any given day. Stacks of executive orders meant to dismantle structures and systems that have supported us for years, and meant to change policies that are in place to protect communities. Such a deluge and a flood that it is, from an emotional and mental perspective, overwhelming and feels like too much because it is too much. Yet, we still have to balance protecting our social, emotional, and mental health with paying attention and keeping our eyes wide open at all times, because if we don't, things that we should always hold on to will be taken from us. And then we will wake up one day even less free than we already are. And so it's important to understand that the Department of Education is responsible for administering a host of federal laws that provide critical resources to vulnerable and historically marginalized populations. And that includes, and this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, but very prominently, the Title I funds. If you've heard of Title I schools, where the vast majority of the students in most of our communities who are attending Title I schools are Black and brown and poor. They qualify for free and reduced price. The students from what Bishop Barber would refer to as poor and low wealth families. $18.4 billion. Title I funds are supported by federal legislation that established that. Students with disabilities. This is the 50th anniversary of the legislation that was passed for students with disabilities, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, $14.2 billion. If you've heard of IEPs, the Individualized Education Plan, which are such a critical consideration when we look at creating and fostering liberated learning spaces, particularly in our public school districts that are engaging a mass number of students with early intervention and special education services from birth to age 21. Career and technical education, Pell Grants, which provide the largest single source of federal support for post-secondary education, specifically to poor and low wealth students. Vocational rehabilitation services to support individuals with disabilities who are preparing for employment. National, state, long-term assessments in reading and mathematics, which is known as the National Assessment of Educational Progress. All of these are governed by federal laws that were written over the years going back to the 1960s up into the last 20 years and are administered by the Department of Education. But on top of that, the Department of Education also enforces two critical laws among several other laws. The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which is known as FERPA, which guarantees parent access to student education records, but also protects parents' rights to keep those records private so that they do not get into the hands of people who will use them to mistreat or otherwise take advantage of vulnerable young people. Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Those of you who've heard of the Office of Civil Rights, which provide for communities that are being subjected to discrimination based on race or national origin. Right here in Winston-Salem, an OCR review that happened over 10 years, going back to 2011, confirmed what we already knew in terms of the reality of disproportionate racialized exclusionary discipline, not just in the middle school and high school levels, but all the way down to the pre-K through 6th level. It is only because this office exists within the Department of Education that a review like that was conducted that has propelled us further along the way in terms of increasing that sense of urgency to make some of the changes that we have, thanks be to God and the work of a collaborative spirit here, been moving forward on to make our schools spaces of greater equity and justice, as well as, of course, learning and achievement. And so in total, the Department of Education administers nearly $80 billion for pre-K through post-secondary education programs. $80 billion that is governed by federal law, that is administered by the Department of Education. And so what is the MAGA agenda for the Department of Education? There are several things that are important to keep in mind. One, they want to shut down all programs inside the department which are not governed by federal law, because those are discretionary programs that, at least the notion is, by executive order, could potentially be shut down without Congress having to be consulted. Shift all programs that are governed by federal law to other agencies within the federal government. Convert funding for students with disabilities into no strings attached block grants to state governments who would have the discretion to spend it as they see fit. This is part of the Project 2025 and the conservative ideology of sending these things back to the states, sending abortion rights back to the states, sending education back to the states. We see the chaos that has ensued since the Dobbs decisions that overturned Roe v. Wade, whatever theological or moral position you have on the act of abortion itself. We see the chaos that has ensued since that ruling came down. And it should be a cautionary tale to us about the type of chaos that would ensue if funding that is right now provided at a federal level to support students with disability, okay, was sent to the states, no strings attached, which means no particular guidelines or requirements for what states must do with that money, how they must use it, how they must filter through lenses of equity and against discrimination and that sort of thing. One can only imagine the disparities that we would see from states in one region of the country governed by folks with a certain mindset and mentality about how education should be done versus states in other parts of the country, and what that would then lead to over time in terms of the disparate abilities and orientation of our students, all having gone through supposedly public school education programs. Number 4 is really important to understand in terms of what we have to be on the lookout for. Part of the agenda is to cancel Title I funding to support poor and low wealth students. That would require the consent of Congress. But as we know, we cannot trust anything in terms of the way that people in Congress will move. And ultimately to close the Department of Education after they have moved through several of these steps. And we also have to be on alert for the agenda to cancel other funding that is governed by some of these federal laws, so that moving these programs to other agencies within the federal government is really a temporary fix as they seek to gain the congressional support to simply shut down funding for programs that they don't believe are worthwhile. So what do we do? What do we do? We have to be, first of all, on alert, as I said, while maintaining and protecting its kind of mental and emotional health and wellness from day to day in the midst of deluge. We have to be on alert for several things. First of all, is the Senate's pending confirmation hearings for Linda McMahon, who was one of the CEOs of the World Wrestling Federation, World Wrestling Entertainment. I was a great fan of wrestling growing up. Certainly don't believe that anybody involved with that has any business running the Department of Education that administers $80 billion in funds to support our students around this country. That is his nominee to lead the Department of Education. And there are, many who believe that full implementation of his plans for the Department of Education are going to be kind of restrained a bit until he gets her in place. So be on alert for the Senate's confirmation hearings and how the different senators on the various committees that have to consider her nomination approach that, and how those on the floor of the Senate approach their decisions and their votes. Be on alert for Trump's executive order seeking to implement this agenda, which is expected in the coming weeks, even if parts of it remain restrained until after he gets Linda McMahon through. Be on alert as more details of these plans emerge. This is not an exhaustive list. I am not an expert on all of this, but a lot of this is information that with a little bit of digging on the internet, you can really avail yourself of from credible resources that can help you to understand what the Department of Education is responsible for. And of course, Project 2025, the top section within that project on what to do about the Department of Education is something that you can access online as well. And finally, be ready. Wherever you are, many of you are calling in here locally from North Carolina, be ready to contact your senator and House of Representatives member when the time comes to register your dissent and urge them to protect our most vulnerable communities. We have to be engaged in the process of refusing and resisting, even as we rest and then repeat and come back to it. Because this agenda relative to the Department of Education has been in the works for many, many years. The Department of Education was established by the late President Jimmy Carter, who just passed here in recent weeks. And so we're talking about a plan that folks have been working on for over 40 years because they were resistant to it at the time. And that resistance has only grown over the years, particularly as they see certain communities that they have never been very supportive of being privileged, so to speak, by this. So that's what I have to share today. I'm more than happy to entertain questions and provide the best answers that I can, and certainly receive any other feedback you can. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ford, for what you've done in terms of preparing to meet with us today, and you have done a great deal's job of sharing with us the essence of what educating our people, empowering them, equipping them, etc. Before we open the floor for additional questions, how do you see this move of dismantling the Department of Education affecting Black colleges?
Yeah, so I think that is going to require a little deeper examination in terms of the role that the Department of Education has played in administering funds to HBCUs, because of course, federal support has been critical to the coffers of our historically Black colleges and universities. And so it's unclear, just based on what I've looked at so far, what the direct impact would be on that issue. I think the bigger thing to consider is that in as much as there is success in canceling, for instance, Title I funding or divesting from some of these programs that disproportionately support Black boys and girls in terms of their educational outcomes at the pre-K through 12 level, that is going to have a direct influence on them even being ready to enter into our colleges and universities in terms of the level of preparation that they have and the access that they have in terms of the barriers that are so often connected to these poor educational outcomes. So the long-term implications are dire. And I think that we have to look and dig a bit more to look at what the short-term implications might be in terms of direct support to our historically Black colleges.
Thank you.